As a writer and a world builder, I really love getting to go to new places and see new environments and biomes and just imagine what life was like there back in history and imagine other worlds where you could have similar climates and places and just use these experiences of my own to inspire my writing and my world building. Last July, so a couple months ago, my husband and I went to Denver, Colorado and the surrounding mountains to allow me to climb a glacier and go on, a general kids-free vacation, which was our first one I think that we've gone on since our honeymoon. So that was really special, but I also really, really wanted to climb a glacier. I really wanted to go up to high altitudes and just experience that and what it's like. And I got to see a bunch of new biomes. I got to see tundra. I got to see boreal forests. I got to experience high altitude and going above the tree line and all of these amazing things. And I want to remember that and remember what it was like and what it looked like and the meadows and the valleys and just everything. So I filmed it and I'm going to take you along on this trip with us. I'm not really a travel vlogger or much of a good vlogger in general, so it's mostly just going to be some clips and I'm going to talk about, the different biomes I'm at, what altitudes I'm at, like what it was like, the experiences of it, cool things like that we did that just, those little bits that were inspirational for me, where if you're watching this, you're probably some form of writer or world builder and maybe you'll find it inspirational too. So let's fly to Denver. I wanted to get going, so immediately upon leaving the airport, we drove to Boulder. Boulder was at the top of our list for places we wanted to visit. Once we had lunch, some free beer, we went and saw the Flatirons, and this gave us enough time to kind of get used to the mile-high altitude before we headed even higher up into the Roosevelt National Forest. Denver may be known as the mile-high city at about 5,280 feet of elevation, but I wanted to hike that glacier, which is a lot higher, and you can't just go up to that elevation without any time to prepare your body and expect to be able to do it. So we sort of planned our hikes for the trip based around slowly increasing the elevations that we would get used to it. Roosevelt National Forest is mostly considered a DFC climate zone, or a subarctic or boreal climate zone, with pine trees, steep cliffs, and winding roads, and beautiful meadows and valleys. Our first hike was Hesse Trail, which is starting at about 9,000 feet in elevation and had about 800 feet of elevation gain for the whole hike. We didn't quite make it all the way up to the lake. The elevation was a bit too much for us, but it definitely gave us some time to start getting used to that. I can't express to you how beautiful the aspen trees and wild flowers and waterfalls were on this hike, but the elevation quickly got to me within a couple of hours and my chest was tight and I was just having trouble catching my breath, so we decided it was time to head back for the night. We were staying at this beautiful boutique bed and breakfast called Flora House in Denver, which was absolutely wonderful. And by the time we got back, it was fairly late in the evening, which was good because Denver was experiencing a bit of a heat wave and it was in the about 100 degree Fahrenheit range in the city during the day, so we definitely didn't want to be there other than at night. But we slept great and then had a wonderful breakfast in the morning, which was exactly what we needed before heading out for that day's hikes. When we arrived at the trailhead for St. Mary's Glacier, it was about 20 degrees cooler than down in Denver, which makes sense given that the trailhead is at 10,428 feet of elevation, but it was surrounded by beautiful pine trees. Once we made it up the steep, rocky path, we came to St. Mary's Lake, which is an alpine lake right beneath St. Mary's Glacier and snowfield. It was surrounded by bristlecone pines and trees that looked like they had been burned in some sort of fire, and large rocks that had probably been transported at some point by the glacier. It was very windy up there, as I'm sure you can hear, but we did okay with the elevation. The tree line, the height at which trees no longer grow, depends on where you are, but in Colorado it tends to be around 11,500 feet, and you can see up near the top of this peak that this is in the transition zone between the forests and alpine meadows and tundra. There wasn't a ton of glacial melt at the time that we went. The waterfall was relatively small, but there was a stream of glacial runoff, which had a fish, which I think is a trout, swimming in it, just in place, keeping up with the flow of the water. The St. Mary's Glacier hike ends right when you reach the glacier, which is just under 11,000 feet, but obviously I wanted to climb the glacier, which involved abandoning my husband and taking both of the trekking poles we had to help climb it, and then I set off to climb the glacier. The glacier was significantly steeper than I expected it would be from how it looked, but it was really difficult climbing up it, and it was very slippery, and honestly, combined with how slippery it was and how windy it was, just blowing me over, it was kind of scary, but I was very determined to get up near the top of it. I'm not sure how well you can hear me up here, but I climbed to the top of the glacier, and this is gotta be 10,000 something, maybe 11,000 feet in elevation right now. We are, I think, above the tree line here. As you can see, there are no trees up here. Also very, very windy, but it's so pretty. I am trying to decide whether or not I want to climb further, but my husband is way down there on that little patch of rock. And it looks closer, it really does, but there's a bend there in that, in the snow in the glacier, the ice field, and it's a lot further than it looks. It was far too windy for you to make out anything I was saying out there. The wind was incredible, but I was so happy I made it up that high, just seeing the alpine tundra meadows and just how open everything was and how high up you were. It felt like the world went on forever, even though I was just near the top of this mountain, and it was amazing to see. Climbing down was definitely easier than climbing up because I wasn't fighting the wind, but it was a lot easier for me to slip, and I did fall down onto my butt a few times. There were a handful of skiers and snowboarders coming down the mountain even in July, which was a bit nerve-wracking for me to watch, especially when they got close to what looked like a drop-off. They're 5,280 feet in a mile, so after going to Denver, the mile-high city, and then hiking up to almost 11,000 feet, I made it to 2 miles up, which is pretty cool. If you've watched any of my world building videos, you know that I have a thing for glaciers and ice ages and basically anything involving glaciation, and getting to see and climb a glacier in person was amazing. After all that hiking, we were starving and decided to drive down into Idaho Springs for lunch. This area is a DFB or humid continental climate with temperate conifers and montane forests. Montane forests are high elevation forests mainly found on the mountain slopes and high plateaus out here, and they are full of ponderosa pines, conifers, spruce firs, and quaking aspen trees. A small mountain city at around 7,500 feet, Idaho Springs has the motto, "Where the Gold Rush Began," because in 1859 they made the first big gold discovery in Colorado when they found placer gold in the creeks and then the gold veins in the canyon walls. It is also known as the birthplace of Colorado-style pizza. For a proper high-altitude experience, we headed along Mount Blue Sky Scenic Byway to Summit Lake. At around 10,000 feet, you leave the montane forests for subalpine forests, and then you rise above the tree line for the true alpine tundra. The views up these mountain roads were absolutely incredible, but I will say the narrow roads became increasingly terrifying, especially above the tree line. I held tight to my steering wheel and tried not to look at the views since I was driving, and I was afraid I would drive off the mountain. Mount Blue Sky is one of Colorado's many 14ers, meaning that it peaks at over 14,000 feet of elevation. The peak of Mount Blue Sky is around 14,265 feet. The summit lake is at almost 13,000 feet, and it is surrounded by alpine tundra grasslands, wetlands where the moisture is trapped by the permafrost, and the summit lake is in a cirque, or a bowl that was carved at the head of a glacier, and it sort of looks like an amphitheater of granite. There were mountain goats on the path, still shedding their thick winter coats for the short 2-month summer. Those chirps are from the marmots down by the lake. They are one of the largest types of squirrels, similar to groundhogs, but they live in rocky outcrops in alpine tundra, and they hibernate in the winter, so we are lucky to come in summer and be able to see them. That is the cutest thing I've ever seen in my entire life. It was so windy up here, and the altitude made it really difficult to breathe, and our hearts felt like they were working overtime, so we had to move around really slowly. There's an overlook where you can see a sheer 700 feet white granite wall called the Black Wall, and this is at the top of this great glacier-carved valley with a chain of alpine lakes going down. If you recall, glaciers move due to internal deformation and they flow over the ground, which is sometimes called creeping. But this valley was once filled by a glacier that carved it, and it flowed down at a surprising speed of 3 feet per day, which is actually slow for glaciers. There are some glaciers elsewhere that can be as fast as 98 feet per day. We were really struggling with the altitude, so we didn't want to risk going up to the peak, so we decided to head back down the road, and I convinced my husband to take more footage, even though he found looking out the window to be a bit terrifying as we drove, which you can probably see based off the conditions here. At the end of the summer, they actually closed all of these roads down and they're entirely repaving them. There were bits along the side of the road, which are basically along the side of cliffs with no trees where you just plummet off the mountain, but that were cracking and had pieces missing, and we basically drove in the middle of the road where we could. This scenic byway definitely is a bit steep. In about 28 miles, it has 7,000 feet of elevation gain, and it is one of the highest paved roads in North America. But we safely made it back down to the alpine and then montane forests once again. I didn't do a lot of filming the rest of the trip. We mostly just rested, relaxed, recovered, had some proper vacation time, went out to really nice restaurants. We went to a cabaret, which was really cool. But I absolutely loved being in Denver. I wish I had some footage of it, but I thought it was really interesting that Denver itself, at the base of these, like montane forests, you get to a steppe grassland, which is, it's a semi-arid climate down in the actual city of Denver. It's pretty dry, even though there's, afternoon thunderstorms and rain so frequently up in the mountains, it's pretty dry and semi-arid down in Denver, which is really cool. When we arrived on our flight and we were just driving along the highways, should have gotten footage of it, but it's just like endless steppe grasslands, and it was so cool. And there were so many little patches of flowers and everything. It was, I don't know, it was just very surprising to me, because when you think of Denver, I guess you just think of the mountains, but you don't think of the, what's at the base of the mountains. I had an amazing time, and I'd love to go back. I really want to climb a 14er at some point, but I would definitely need to go with a guide, because I don't actually have the skills to do that. I was reading on it, and a lot of the articles were suggesting things like make sure you have emergency flares, because you won't necessarily have service up there, and if you need to ask for help, and make sure you have climbing gear for some of these, because you're climbing up a stiff peak, and you're hiking for many miles, but in the afternoon, especially above the tree line, it's so dangerous because there's those very strong freak storms where all of a sudden it's just thundering and lightning and there's no cover, which is just a very different experience. And everyone always says, plan your hike so that you can be back below the tree line by afternoon. I think, it depends on the timing, but you just are sitting there when you're planning these hikes looking at the weather. When we went to Mount Blue Sky, it was in the afternoon, but we had checked the weather beforehand, and at that point in the afternoon, we're like, okay, we've had lunch. There's nothing on the radar, so it's probably safe to go up there. But I just think it'd be a really cool thing to experience. But I hope you enjoyed this little look with me on our vacation that we took to the mountains of Colorado, and just seeing some of these climates and biomes and stuff firsthand for the first time for me. And yeah, I will see you in the next one.